Today we're going to do Daf Pei Gimel, maybe Pei Dalet as well, to try to fill in some of what we missed on Yom Tov. And on Pei Beis Amid Beis, we won't read the Gemara inside, but we'll just try to summarize. We had a machlokus between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva that we covered in the last discussion on Erev Yom Tov. And the question is, how do we know that the Korban Pesach cannot come from Meiser Sheni money, but only from Chulin? And the Gemara had one Yalfusa based on Rabbi Eliezer, and that had to do with the fact that Pesach, when they left Mitzrayim, could not possibly have had Meiser Sheni, because there was no Meiser Sheni, and Rabbi Eliezer added another proof from the fact that during the Midbar, 40 years, they brought the Korban Pesach in the Mishkan without Meiser Sheni. Rabbi Akiva rejects that drasha, and now the Gemara asks, where then does Rabbi Akiva derive the halacha that a Pesach cannot be brought from Meiser Sheni, but only from Chulin? And the Gemara says that Rabbi Akiva is going to derive it from a pasuk, and this pasuk is going to be the subject of our discussion today, and it's based on Tana Rabbi Lozar. The pasuk is in Vayikra Zayin. Actually, we say it in the piyut for these days of Pesach, and the pasuk says V'zos HaTorah li'olah lemincha lechatos lasham lemiluim lezevach hashlomim. So each one of these words has to be interpreted. First, we start with Olah. And each one of these words is going to teach me something about all of Karbanos. The pasuk of Olah, as the Gemara is going to quote here from Tana Rabbi Eliezer, is Ma Olah Ta'una Kli, Af Kol Ta'un Kli. That all the Karbanos require a Klisharis. And here we have a machlokes, exactly what we're talking about. Maihi, the Gemara rejects Mizrak, Ileva Mizrak, which is the bowl that's used to receive the blood when the second Kohen in the series of 4 Kohanim does the Avodah of Kabbalah, is Gabi Zivche Shalmei Tzibur Namiksiv Vayosem Ba'aganos. At the end of Parshas Mishpatim, in Sefer Shmos, when they brought Olos for the Tzibur, and they brought Shlomim as well, it says Vayosim Ba'aganos, that the dam was placed into receptacles. So if that be the case, then we don't need this pasuk to teach me that with regard to Karbanos, we need a kli to be Makabel Adam, that we can certainly learn from Shlomim. Ella, but rather the Gemara says it's Sakin, that the knife that's used to slaughter the animal in Ola and by virtue of Ola in all Karbanos has to be a Klisharis. So the Gemara right now rejects this by saying, wait a minute, Ola Gufa Minolan. You're deriving conclusions from Ola, extrapolating for all Karbanos. How do you know that Ola itself requires a Sakin? And the Gemara surprisingly derives it from Avram Avinu at the Akedah, and the pasuk says, "Vayishlach Avraham es yado vayikaches hamacheles l'shchotes bino and hasam olahu." Right, the pasuk says, "Vayaleu li'ola tachas bino." So now we go on to the second word in this pasuk, umincha. And what do we derive from mincha to all karbanos? Ma mincha einin acheles el zichrei kahuna. Only the Zichrei Kahuna are allowed to eat from the mincha. That means after the kmitza, the shirayim is eaten by the kohanim. Af kol ein nechol l'Zichrei Kahuna. Now, what are these other korbanos that could be eaten by Zichrei Kahuna and only by Zichrei Kahuna? Chatas v'yasham. If you're telling me that from Mincha derived that in Chatas v'yasham, Zichrei Kahuna can eat from the korbanos, from the basar. So Gemara says here on the top of Pei Gimel, Behedja Ksiv. That's written explicitly in the pasuk in Vayikra Vav with regard to Chatos. And later on in Vayikra Zayin with regard to the Asham, if it's coming to teach me that the Shnei Kvasim that are brought on Chag HaShavuos as part of the Avodah the Shtei Alechem, and they will require a limited heter that would only allow Kohanim, Zichrei Kahuna, to eat the basar, that is not necessary because miribuya dekroy asi. We have a brisa that derives it from an extra pasuk, Ba'kodesh HaKadoshim tochlenu kol zochar yochal oso, and it says explicitly that only male Kohanim are allowed to eat it. And limate from this pasuk al zivchei shalmei tzibur, which have the status of kodesh kadoshim, it's the only shlomim that's kodesh kodshim, is the shalmei tzibur of Chag HaShavuos, einachol el zichrei kahuna. So at this point, the Gemara is baffled as to why we have to derive from mincha that only the Kohanim are allowed to eat the basar. We know it in Chatos and Asham because it's explicit. And even in the case of Shalmei Tzibur, we have a derivation from a ribui from Kodesh Kadosh and Tochlenu Kol Zochar, etc. So the Gemara answers Tanoi that we're now entering into Machlokas Tanoim, and this brisa that we're quoting here of Tana Debei Rabbi Eliezer is going quite to one particular sheet in the Tanoim. Ika demaise mehacha ve'ika demaise le mehacha. So some will derive the halacha of Zichrei Kahuna from this pasuk of Bakodesh Kadashim, and others, like Rabbi Eliezer, will derive it from Mincha. Now we go on to the next word in this pasuk, chatos. What is that teaching us? Ma chatos mekadeshes bibilua. Anything that touches the korban chatos becomes sanctified with all the isurim that would apply to the chatos itself. Af kol mekadshi bibilua. The same halacha bilua to be mekadesh basar chulin by contact with a korban applies to all korbanos. So that's why we need the pasuk of chatos. So, for example, let's say you have basar of shlomim, and it comes in contact with basar of asham, then it takes upon itself all the chumras of a korban asham, and therefore cannot be eaten by the bailim. Asham, why does the pasuk have to single out asham? What is that teaching us? Ma asham ein shvir v'shilya kadosh bo. There are two parts of the animal that come into being in a female animal at the point of conception. They slowly grow in the animal, and that's the fetus and the cilia, which is the amniotic sac, and those are not sanctified. And therefore, we're going to expand from asham to all korbanos. The Gemara says, wait a minute, that depends upon two opinions on a machlokas. Number one, we have a machlokes as to whether or not the vlad of kodshim is ba'aviyasam heim kedoshim. In other words, immediately when they come into this world, and that's at birth, right? That's one opinion. And that's based on the pasuk Rak Kodshecha Asher Yelecha Ubas El Amakom Asher Yivchar Hashem. And then we have another shita in the Gemara in Tmura that we don't even have to wait until birth, but rather from the moment of conception, the vlad is already sanctified. We don't have to wait for birth. Rabbi Eliezer holds that the vlad of kodshim is sanctified at birth, not from the moment of conception. And therefore, that which came into being in the animal's body before birth, but after conception, is um, is not kodesh, and only that which is after birth, that's kodesh. But now we have another problem because Asham could never have a nekeva. Vidonim efshar mishei efshar. In other words, with regard to Kodem Asham, there's no such thing as a fetus. It just simply cannot exist. An Asham must be made, it must be a male animal. But Donim efshar mishalo efshar. Now the pasuk goes on and tells us miluim. What do we learn from miluim? Miluim mosroseim bisreifa v'ein balichaim mosroseim bisreifa. Afkol mosroseim bisreifa v'ein balichaim mosroseim bisreifa. So exactly what mosroseim is again a controversy. Some say that, let's say you were magdish two animals, one for the Mizbeach and the other as a replacement in event that the first one gets lost. And now, once you go ahead, you makriv one of the two animals, the other animal becomes Mosar. Then we have another possibility where he was magdish only one animal, but that animal got lost, and before he found it, he went ahead and he was magdish a second animal. Now, there's something called Mosar, which is called Nosar, and that's after the allotted time expires, and the Nosar has to be burnt. But as with regard to a living Mosar, that we're going to derive from Miluim. And that means Mosroseim b'sreifa, v'ein balechayim Mosroseim b'sreifa. So when it says Mosroseim b'sreifa, we mean Nosar, right? The meat that was left over past its allotted time. And Balichaim is referring to those two possible scenarios that we mentioned before, and they are not B'sreifa. Shlomim, what is the pasuk Shlomim teaching me? Ma Shlomim mefaglin mispaglin af kol mefaglin miskal. The parsha of Pigul appears in the parsha of Shlomim. It doesn't appear in any of the other karbonos. And therefore, we're going to use Shlomim as our paradigmic case of Pigul. And what's the difference between mefaglin and mispaglim? They're actually two sides of a coin. If he had a machshavas chutz lizmano during any of the four avodos, in the case of Shlomim, because again the parsha here is Shlomim, then the korban itself becomes pigul. What does it mean mefaglim? That's a reference to the niskei yayin that have to accompany a korban Shlomim. They also become pigul. And this is going to apply to all korbanos. Masnisa Tana Mishmei de Rabbi Akiva. However, we have a brisa in the name of Rabbi Akiva that will allow Rabbi Akiva to derive the halacha that you cannot use Meiser Sheni for a korban from a different pasuk. Zos HaTorah, that was the pasuk that we were dealing with. And this brisa says, Mincha, What do we derive from mincha? That which we derived originally from chatos in the first brisa, from this second brisa, is going to be derived from mincha, and that is ma mincha mekadeshes bibilua, af kol mekadsha bibilua. So the halacha of contact that generates kiddush is derived from mincha because it says in mincha in Vayikra Perik Vav it says kol asher yiga b'hem yikdash. And from mincha, we're going to derive it by comparison, by now to all korbanos. Oh, so now we're stuck with chatos. Why do we need chatos? Because we used chatos for bilua. Now we need chatos for something else because we don't need it for bilua. Bilua we derive from mincha. For chatos, we need again the halacha bilua a second time around in the case of chatos. If we only had the pasuk by mincha, we would say mishum derechicha bola. This belia has to do with the fact that the mincha is a mincha blula b'shemen. As a result, it's rechicha. Rechicha means it absorbs, it's soft. Vachatos is meat. Meat doesn't absorb, so we might think that the halacha bilua doesn't apply because in Mitzias the basar is not boleh. But the ikos of rachmana bechatos, I couldn't derive any conclusions for mincha regarding mincha because mishum de basar agav de shomin kadir. Basar is a very oily substance, very fatty. And therefore, kadir means there's a bilua that penetrates deep, deep into the basar. And this, by the way, has to do also with halachas of mixtures of milk and meat, that the milk will penetrate into the basar because of the fatty nature of the basar. Aval mincha emalo. I might think the mincha doesn't have that fatty nature. Tzrich, I need both. Now, the Gemara quotes now a brisa which is going to derive something else from chatos. And this is going to help Rabbi Akiva, because if you remember, we started by asking, how is Rabbi Akiva going to derive the halacha that you cannot bring a carbon from Meiser Sheni, it has to come from Chulin. Ma chatos einu ba'olam el Chulin. Now we have three halachas that are derived from chatos. Number one is chulin, that to the exclusion of Maser Sheni. Number two, bayom, it's got to be during the day. Ubiyado hayimonis, and the kohen has to use his right hand. So these three halachas apply, extrapolated from chatos to all korbanos. Fact the Gemara, chatos gufa mino. And how do you know the chatos cannot come from Meiser Sheni? Omar Rav Chizda, the Omar Krav, Ekriv Aaron es parachatos asher lo. So this l'chora will lead us to the machlokes between Rab Meir and the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda about whether Meiser Sheni is Mammon Gavah, Mammon Hedgel. But right now, we're holding that Meiser Sheni is Mammon Gavah. And therefore, when it says Asher Lo, it means Mishalo v'lo Mishal Maser, because Maser is Mammon Gavah. However, Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that Maser Sheni is Mammon Hedgel, it's privately owned. It's not owned by Hegdesh, but in this case, says Rashi, he would concede that the pasuk of the Hikriv Aaron as Parachat Shelo is coming to exclude Maser Sheni. Bayom, Mibiyom Tzavoso Nafka. Why do you need a pasuk from Chatos to compare an analogy of Karbonos to Chatos? The pasuk says Yom Tzavoso. So it has to be during the day. Kedi Nasba. Now this phrase Kedi Nasba is going to appear over and over again in today's daf. And it means that sometimes things are mentioned that are not necessary. That's called Kedi Nasba. Biyada Yamonis, and this we're deriving from Chatos. Fact the Gemara, I don't need Biyada or Hayamonis from Chatos. Vida Rabba Bar Bar Chana Nafka. The Omer Rabba Bar Chana, we've had this in the past. Omer Reish Lakish, Kol Mokum Shenemer Etzba Ukuhuna, Eina El Yamin. Kedinas. Again, we're going to apply this principle of something that's unnecessary. It's like a theoretical limud. Asham, what do we derive from Asham? Asham atzmos of mutarim. Afkol atzmos of mutarim. So now we're talking about the bones of not only an Asham, but also of an Ola. Now, in the Parsha of Asham, which is in Vayikra Perek Zayin, in which case, after the avod is complete and the dam is nizrak al gam mizbeach, then the meat is permitted to the kohen. And again, if the meat is left over till tomorrow, it's no and has to be burnt. However, what part of nosar has to be burnt? Only that which is roy lachila. However, the bones, it depends. If it has edible marrow, then it has to be burnt. But if it doesn't contain any edible marrow, then it's mutter, and you could use it for any purpose. Make it into a handle for a utensil. And the same thing, by virtue of this derivation from Asham, applies to an Ola. And the bones of an Ola is not burnt on the Mizbeach, but can be used for anything. So again, Rabbi Akiva comes to the conclusion that from Chatos, we derive the conclusion that it has to come from Chulin. Our Mishnah, on the other hand, derives the halacha of Chulin from a different pasuk, and that's the pasuk in the parsha of Korban Pesach. So now the Gemara is going to try to figure out what does Rabbi Akiva, who derives the requirement of Chulin from Chatos, what does he do with the pasuk by Korban Pesach? Rabbi Akiva, Hai v'zavachta Pesach, my Ovid.